What if someone told you exactly how you were going to die, decades before it happened? What if they described technology that wouldn't exist for another 50 years? And what if they knew your name, your face, your secrets, before you were even born? These aren't hypotheticals. These are real accounts from people who survived something impossible. People who returned with knowledge they couldn't possibly have. 10 cases, 10 survivors, details they shouldn't know. Let's begin. Imagine you're lying on an operating table. The lights above you blur into halos. Your heart stops beating. For 4 minutes and 22 seconds, you are clinically dead. And in that space between life and death, you see something impossible, a future that hasn't happened yet, a medical procedure that won't exist for another 32 years. When you wake up, you remember everything, every detail, every instrument, every technique, and no one believes a single word you say. This is exactly what happened to Dr. Harold Vance in the autumn of 1987. Dr. Vance was 67 years old, a retired cardiac surgeon living in Columbus, Ohio. He had spent 40 years opening chests and repairing hearts. He knew the human body better than most people know their own homes. On October 14, 1987, he went in for a routine gallbladder removal, simple procedure, low risk. But something went wrong. His heart stopped on the table. The monitors flatlined. For 4 minutes and 22 seconds, Harold Vance was dead. And then he wasn't. When the surgical team revived him, Vance was disoriented but strangely calm. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't panic. Instead, he asked for a pen and paper. Over the next several hours, while still recovering from anesthesia, he began sketching. Detailed diagrams, technical specifications. A procedure he called transcatheter valve replacement. He drew flexible catheters threading through blood vessels. He sketched deployment mechanisms that could implant artificial valves without cracking open a patient's chest. He described imaging guidance systems that would allow surgeons to see inside the heart in real time. He even named specific polymer compounds that would make the catheters flexible enough to navigate the body's winding architecture. His colleagues thought he had lost his mind. The technology Vance described simply did not exist in 1987. Catheter-based procedures were primitive. The imaging systems he sketched were decades away. The polymers he named hadn't been synthesized yet. When doctors reviewed his diagrams, they dismissed them as the confused ramblings of an oxygen-deprived brain, a hallucination, a fever dream dressed up in medical terminology. Vance insisted otherwise. He said he hadn't imagined the procedure, he had seen it. During those 4 minutes of clinical death, he claimed he found himself standing in an operating room unlike anything he recognized. The walls were covered in digital screens. Robotic arms assisted surgeons. And on the table, a patient was undergoing the exact procedure he had drawn. He watched every movement, every adjustment, every stitch. He said it felt like hours, though his heart had stopped for less than 5 minutes. No one listened. Vance compiled his drawings and descriptions into a 47-page document. He submitted it to 3 medical journals. All 3 rejected it as speculative fiction. He tried presenting at conferences. He was politely ignored. Eventually, he stopped trying. The document was filed away in the Ohio Medical Archive, forgotten among thousands of other papers that no one would ever read. Harold Vance died in 2003, still convinced of what he had seen, still frustrated that no one believed him. And then something extraordinary happened. In 2019, transcatheter aortic valve replacement, now known as TAVR, became one of the most celebrated advances in cardiac surgery. The procedure allows surgeons to replace damaged heart valves through a catheter inserted in the leg. No open heart surgery required. The technique has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. A medical historian researching the origins of minimally invasive cardiac surgery stumbled upon Vance's archived document. When he compared the 1987 diagrams to modern TAVR specifications, he went pale. The catheter dimensions matched exactly. The polymer compounds Vance named were the same ones developed in the 2010s. The imaging guidance systems he described mirrored technology that wouldn't be invented for decades. Every single detail aligned. How is this possible? Some researchers believe that near-death experiences can temporarily free consciousness from linear time. They theorize that the dying brain, desperate for information, may reach forward into its own timeline, accessing memories that technically haven't been formed yet. Others believe Vance somehow tapped into a kind of universal information field, a repository of knowledge encoded in the fabric of space-time itself. Harold Vance saw the future of medicine while his heart was stopped. He documented it perfectly, and for 32 years, no one believed him. Now imagine you're 7 years old. You live in a small fishing village on the coast of Thailand. The ocean is your backyard. The sound of waves is your lullaby. But lately, the dreams have started. Every night, the same nightmare. A wall of water taller than any building you've ever seen. Your school disappearing beneath the surge. Bodies floating where your friends used to play. You wake up screaming, but no one understands. How could they? The disaster you're dreaming about hasn't happened yet. This is the story of a girl named Lila, and what she saw 6 months before the world watched in horror. In June of 2004, Lila began drawing. Not the typical drawings of a 7-year-old. Not houses with smiling suns or stick-figure families. She drew waves, enormous towering waves crashing into buildings. She drew boats wedged into rooftops. She drew her school with water pouring through the windows, desks floating in muddy currents. Her parents found the drawings disturbing, but assumed she had seen something frightening on television. A disaster movie, perhaps. An overactive imagination processing images it couldn't fully understand. They told her everything was fine. They told her the ocean was safe, but Lila kept drawing. Over the following months, her artwork became increasingly specific. She drew her grandmother's house with water reaching exactly to the 3rd step of the porch. She drew a fishing boat she recognized from the harbor, twisted and broken, lodged into the 2nd floor of the hotel where tourists stayed. She drew a man in a red shirt, arms raised, standing on a rooftop surrounded by debris. She couldn't explain why she was drawing these things. She only knew that every night she saw them, and every morning she felt compelled to put them on paper. Her parents grew concerned. They took her to doctors who found nothing wrong. They consulted a local monk who blessed her and told them her spirit was sensitive. But Lila's behavior changed in other ways too. She became anxious near the water. She begged her parents to visit relatives who lived inland, far from the coast. She cried when they refused, insisting that they needed to leave, that the water was coming, that everyone needed to get away from the ocean. On December 26, 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami struck. A magnitude 9.1 earthquake off the coast of Sumatra generated waves that reached heights of over 30 meters in some areas. More than 230,000 people died across 14 countries. Lila's village was devastated. Her school was destroyed. Many of her classmates never came home. But Lila survived. Her family had finally agreed to visit relatives inland that week, a trip Lila had begged for with increasing desperation as December approached. They left 2 days before the wave hit. When her parents returned to assess the damage, they brought Lila's drawings with them. What they discovered made them tremble. A journalist documenting survivor stories heard about the drawings and asked to see them. He spent weeks comparing Lila's artwork to photographs taken in the tsunami's aftermath. He found 23 specific correlations that could not be explained by coincidence. The fishing boat Lila had drawn was found exactly where she depicted it, wedged into the hotel's 2nd floor. Her grandmother's house showed water damage reaching precisely to the 3rd porch step. And in one photograph, circulated widely in the international news coverage, a man in a red shirt stood on a rooftop with his arms raised, surrounded by debris, the same image Lila had drawn months before. How does a 7-year-old girl draw a disaster that hasn't occurred? How does she capture details she couldn't possibly know? Some researchers believe that children's minds are less rigidly bound to linear time. Their perception of reality hasn't fully solidified, making them more susceptible to what some call temporal bleed-through. Others theorize that Lila somehow received echoes from her own future consciousness, traumatized memories reaching backward through time to warn her younger self. Lila is an adult now. She refuses to discuss the drawings. Those who know her say she hasn't dreamed since 2004, as if whatever connection existed was severed by the trauma. But the drawings still exist, dated months before the tsunami, depicting exactly what would happen. She knew, and no one listened until it was too late. Picture this. You check your phone and see a missed call from your own number. Not a number similar to yours. Your exact number. You assume it's a glitch, some kind of technical error, and you're about to delete the voicemail without listening. But something makes you hesitate. You press play, and the voice you hear is not yours. It's your son's voice. But not the voice of the 8-year-old boy sleeping down the hall. It's the voice of a middle-aged man, and he's calling from the year 2037. This is exactly what happened to Sarah Whitmore on a quiet Tuesday evening in Manchester, England, and to this day, no one can explain it. It was November 15th, 2011. Sarah was 34 years old, a single mother working as an accountant, living a perfectly ordinary life. She had just put her son James to bed when she noticed the notification: 1 missed call, 1 voicemail. The caller ID displayed her own mobile number. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A network malfunction, she thought. Some crossed wire in the system. She nearly swiped it away without a second thought, but curiosity got the better of her. She pressed play. The message was 2 minutes and 47 seconds long. The voice that came through the speaker was deep, weary, and unmistakably emotional. Quote 0. Sarah's blood went cold. The voice was nothing like her 8-year-old son's. It was a man's voice, tired, strained, but something in the cadence, something in the way he said "Mum," felt achingly familiar. The message continued. The man who claimed to be James described specific events. He told Sarah she would be diagnosed with cancer in 2018. He said she would recover, that the treatment would work, that she needed to trust her doctors even when the news seemed hopeless. He mentioned his own wedding in 2031, a woman named Claire, a ceremony by the sea. And then he said something that made Sarah stop breathing entirely. "I need you to know about the blackout of 2035. Everything changes after that, but we're okay. I needed you to know we're okay. I love you, Mom. I've always loved you." The line went dead. Sarah sat in her kitchen for over an hour, replaying the message again and again. She told herself it was a prank, a cruel, elaborate hoax. Someone had spoofed her number and hired an actor. But who would do that? And how would they know to call her mom in that specific way? She saved the voicemail. She couldn't bring herself to delete it. Then 2018 arrived. Sarah was diagnosed with breast cancer in March of that year, the same diagnosis the voicemail had described 7 years earlier. She underwent treatment, and against difficult odds, she recovered. Exactly as the voice had promised. The coincidence shook her to her core. She retrieved the old voicemail and listened to it again with new ears. Every word felt different now. Every word felt true. Audio forensic experts have analyzed the recording 3 separate times. They found no evidence of splicing, no digital manipulation, no markers consistent with AI-generated voice synthesis. The technology to convincingly fake a human voice simply did not exist in 2011. The phone company investigated the call's origin and found nothing. No record of where the call came from. No explanation for how it was placed. Some physicists theorize that under extreme emotional or energetic conditions, electromagnetic signals could theoretically cross temporal boundaries, radio waves bending through time rather than space. Others believe Sarah received a message from a parallel timeline, her son in an alternate future reaching across dimensional walls to deliver comfort to his mother. James Whitmore is now 21 years old. He has no memory of making the call. He cannot explain how his future voice reached his mother's phone. He doesn't know anyone named Claire, but the voicemail still exists. The timestamp still reads November 15th, 2011. And somewhere in that recording, a man who hasn't been born yet tells his mother that everything will be okay. Imagine you're an architect in Soviet Russia. The year is 1962. The Cold War grips the world. Your government demands concrete bunkers and utilitarian housing blocks. Function over form, strength over beauty. But in your mind, you see something else entirely. You see towers that twist toward the sky. You see buildings made of glass and light, floating gardens suspended between floors, cities that seem to breathe. You sketch these visions obsessively, unable to stop. Your colleagues call you a dreamer, your supervisors call you unstable. But you know what you've seen is real, because you didn't imagine these buildings. You visited them, in a city that won't exist for another 50 years. This is the story of Konstantin Volkov, and the blueprints that would haunt the architectural world for decades. Volkov was a mid-level architect working in Leningrad in the early 1960s. By all accounts, he was competent but unremarkable. He designed apartment complexes and government offices. the same gray structures that defined Soviet urban planning. But in 1961, everything changed. Volkov suffered a severe mental breakdown. He was hospitalized for weeks with a fever that doctors couldn't explain. When he finally recovered, he was a different man. He spoke of visions, cities of glass rising from desert sands, towers that rotated slowly, following the sun across the sky, streets suspended in the air between buildings. His doctors attributed it to the fever. His family hoped he would return to normal. He never did. Instead, Volkov began designing. Not the utilitarian structures his government demanded, but impossible buildings that seemed to defy physics. His most obsessive project was a residential tower with a unique feature. The entire structure twisted gradually from base to top, rotating a full 90 degrees over its height. He calculated wind load distributions for a shape that had never been built. He specified floor plate rotations that would allow each level to offer different views. He described sustainable cooling systems that didn't exist, materials that hadn't been invented, and construction techniques that Soviet engineering couldn't achieve. His colleagues thought he had lost his mind completely. Volkov insisted he wasn't inventing these designs. He claimed that during his fever, he had experienced something beyond hallucination. He said he found himself walking through a city unlike anything on Earth, towers of chrome and glass reflecting sunlight, gardens growing on vertical walls, a twisted residential building that dominated the skyline. He spent hours inside this vision, studying the architecture, memorizing the details, feeling the texture of materials beneath his fingertips. When the fever broke, the images remained, and he couldn't stop trying to recreate what he had seen. By 1967, Volkov's behavior had become too erratic. He was institutionalized, his blueprints confiscated and archived. He spent the remaining years of his life in and out of psychiatric facilities, never abandoning his claims, never wavering from his story. He died in 1989, forgotten and dismissed as a brilliant mind destroyed by mental illness. And then, in 2010, something remarkable happened. In Dubai, the Kayan Tower was completed, a 75-story residential building with a distinctive feature. The entire structure twists 90 degrees from base to top. An architecture student researching Soviet modernism discovered Volkov's archived blueprints while working on her thesis. When she compared them to the Kayan Tower's specifications, she felt the room spin around her. The measurements were identical. The degree of rotation matched exactly. The wind load calculations, the floor plate specifications, even the sustainable cooling concepts Volkov had described aligned precisely with the building standing in Dubai. How does a Soviet architect in 1962 design a building that won't be constructed for nearly 50 years, in a city that barely existed when he was alive? Some researchers who study temporal anomalies believe that intense altered states of consciousness, fever, near-death experiences, extreme psychological stress can sometimes create what they call temporal windows, brief openings through which information from other times can leak into the present mind. Konstantin Volkov's blueprints sit in a Leningrad archive. The Kayan Tower stands in Dubai. The measurements are the same. The details match perfectly. A madman's fever dream or a genuine glimpse of the future. Only 13% of viewers who reach this point are actually subscribed. If these cases are keeping you up at night, you'll want to see what's coming next. Subscribe now. The most disturbing case is still ahead. Imagine you're standing in a prison cell. The door has just slammed shut behind you for a crime you didn't commit. The walls press in. The air tastes like despair. You know you're innocent. You know the truth. But the world has decided you're guilty, and you'll spend the rest of your life trying to prove otherwise. Now imagine that in this moment of absolute hopelessness, you know something impossible. You know the exact date you'll walk free. Not a guess, not a hope. A certainty so deep, it feels like memory. And that date is 41 years away. This is the story of Marcus Webb, the man who knew his release date before his sentence even began. In 1974, Marcus Webb was convicted of murder in Birmingham, Alabama. He was 23 years old, black, poor, and in the wrong place at the wrong time. An eyewitness claimed she saw him fleeing the scene. The evidence was circumstantial at best. The trial lasted 4 days. The all-white jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Marcus Webb was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest. He would continue to maintain it for the next 4 decades. But here's where the story takes an impossible turn. On his very first day in Holman Correctional Facility, Marcus Webb made a statement that would be documented in prison records and remembered by guards for years to come. He looked at the officer processing his intake, a man named Samuel Tucker, and said calmly, "I'll walk out of here on March 14th, 2015, not a day sooner, not a day later." Tucker laughed. Of course he did. Here was a young man just convicted of murder, sentenced to die behind bars, and he was already predicting his release date. It seemed like denial, delusion, the desperate fantasy of a man who couldn't accept his fate. Tucker wrote it down in his notes anyway, more as a curiosity than anything else. But Marcus Webb never wavered. Over the following decades, Webb repeated that date to anyone who would listen. He wrote it in letters to his family. He marked it in every journal he kept. He told cellmates, chaplains, lawyers, and social workers. March 14th, 2015. Always the same date, always with the same quiet certainty. What made it stranger was what else he said. He described the process that would free him in terms that made no sense in the 1970s. He spoke of them finding the truth in his blood. He mentioned a machine that reads the invisible code. He talked about new science that would prove what really happened. In 1998, Webb was offered a parole hearing. He declined. Quote 4, he said. In 2007, another hearing was scheduled. Again, he refused to attend. Guards thought he had given up. Lawyers thought he had lost his mind. But Webb wasn't giving up. He was waiting. In 2014, the Innocence Project took interest in his case. New DNA testing technology, unavailable in 1974, was applied to evidence from the original crime scene. The results were conclusive. Marcus Webb's DNA was not present. Another man's genetic material was found, a man who had died in 1992 but had been a suspect in similar crimes. The conviction was overturned. On March 14, 2015, Marcus Webb walked out of Holman Correctional Facility, a free man, exactly 41 years after he predicted he would. Prison records confirm he stated this date on his first day of incarceration. Multiple guards signed statements verifying his consistent claims across 4 decades. He never changed the date. He never doubted it. He simply knew. When journalists asked him how, Marcus Webb offered no explanation. He simply said, "I saw myself walk out. I always knew I would. I just had to wait for the world to catch up." Some theorists believe that individuals under extreme psychological trauma can occasionally perceive their own future. The mind, desperate for hope, reaches forward through time to find it. Marcus Webb died in 2019, 4 years after his release. He never explained his knowledge, but the records remain, the date remains, and the question remains. How did he know? Now imagine you're sitting alone in your garage late at night. The glow of radio equipment surrounds you. Dials, switches, frequencies crackling with static from around the world. You've been a ham radio operator for 30 years. You know every sound these machines can make, but tonight, something different cuts through the noise. A voice, clear and urgent, calling from a frequency that was decommissioned 60 years ago. And the voice knows your name, your full name, before you were even born. This is what happened to David Chen on the night of October the 3rd, 2019. And it changed everything he thought he understood about time. David Chen was 52 years old, living in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Ham radio had been his passion since childhood. He spent countless nights scanning frequencies, connecting with operators across continents, listening to the invisible conversations that crisscross our atmosphere. He knew the equipment intimately. He knew which frequencies were active, which were abandoned, which were reserved for military use. So, when his receiver picked up a transmission on a frequency officially decommissioned in 1961, he froze. The voice was male, steady but strained, fighting against waves of static. This is Lieutenant Frank Morrison, Strategic Air Command, transmitting from Holloman Air Force Base. The date is October 3rd, 1958. If anyone receives this transmission in the future, please respond. Something has gone wrong. We've experienced what they're calling temporal displacement. I don't know if this signal can reach through. I don't know if anyone will ever hear this. David Chen's hands trembled over the dial. October 3rd, 1958. Exactly 61 years to the day before he was hearing this transmission. He tried to respond, but the signal was one way, locked in time, unreachable. Then Morrison said something that made David's heart stop completely. If this reaches the future, find David Chen in Albuquerque. Tell him about the 1987 incident. He needs to know. He needs to understand what happened wasn't an accident. David Chen was born in 1967, 9 years after this transmission supposedly originated. There was no possible way Lieutenant Frank Morrison could have known his name, no possible way he could have known where David would live, and yet the voice spoke with absolute certainty, as if delivering a message meant specifically for him, the 1987 incident. David knew exactly what that meant. In 1987, when David was 20 years old, he was driving on Interstate 40 outside Albuquerque. It was late evening. He was tired, and then, for reasons he could never explain, he felt an overwhelming urge to swerve. Not a thought, not a decision. A compulsion that moved his hands before his mind could process it. Seconds later, a truck ran a red light at the intersection he would have entered. The collision killed 2 people in another vehicle. David should have been there. Something made him turn away. He had always called it instinct, a lucky feeling. Now a voice from 1958 was telling him it wasn't luck at all. David searched military records. Lieutenant Frank Morrison was real. He served at Holloman Air Force Base in the late 1950s. He was a pilot assigned to classified test flights. On October 3rd, 1958, exactly 61 years before David received the transmission, Lieutenant Morrison disappeared during an experimental flight. No wreckage was ever recovered. No body was ever found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. The cause was never determined. Did Morrison's experimental flight tear a hole in time? Did his radio transmission travel 61 years into the future? And if so, how did he know David Chen's name? How did he know about an accident that wouldn't happen for another 29 years? Some researchers believe that radio waves under specific conditions could theoretically traverse time as easily as space. Others theorize that Morrison himself became unstuck in time, existing simultaneously across decades, sending warnings to people whose lives intersected with his displacement. Lieutenant Frank Morrison was never found, but his voice reached David Chen 61 years later, a warning about an event that had already happened, past and future tangled together in a single radio signal. We're halfway through, but the most impossible cases are still ahead. 87% of viewers watching right now aren't subscribed. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe and stay until the end. Picture yourself sorting through a box of old photographs at an estate sale. The images are faded, cracked at the edges, relics from a world that no longer exists. Factory workers in 1940s clothing, assembly lines building machinery for a war that ended decades ago. And then you see her. A woman standing among the workers, looking down at something in her hands, a small rectangular device. A glowing screen, icons visible on its surface. She's holding what looks exactly like a smartphone, in a photograph from 1943. This is the mystery that emerged in 2017, and the woman in the photograph shouldn't exist for another 35 years. The collector's name was Richard Brennan. He purchased a box of vintage photographs at an estate sale in Detroit, Michigan. The collection belonged to the family of a man who had worked at a manufacturing plant during World War II. Most images showed typical wartime factory scenes. Workers assembling parts, supervisors checking equipment, patriotic posters on the walls. But one photograph stopped Brennan cold. Among the rows of workers stood a young woman, perhaps late 20s, dressed appropriately for the era. But her attention wasn't on the assembly line. She was looking down at something in her hands. A small, flat, rectangular object that seemed to glow faintly. Enhanced imaging revealed what appeared to be a touch screen with visible icons arranged in a grid. The object was unmistakably modern, unmistakably wrong. Brennan had the photograph authenticated by 3 separate experts. The paper was consistent with 1940s manufacturing. The chemical composition of the print matched wartime developing processes. The aging patterns were natural, not artificially created. Every test confirmed the photograph was genuinely from 1943. But then investigators took a different approach. They ran the woman's face through modern facial recognition software, and what they found defied explanation. The software matched the woman to Jennifer Holloway, a Michigan resident born in 1978, 35 years after the photograph was taken. When investigators contacted Jennifer, she was initially dismissive. Another case of mistaken identity, a coincidental resemblance. But when she saw the photograph, her skepticism crumbled. She recognized the face immediately. It was hers, not someone who looked like her exact features, her exact bone structure. And then she noticed something else. On the woman's left wrist, partially visible beneath her sleeve, was a distinctive birthmark, shaped like a crescent moon, the same birthmark Jennifer had carried her entire life. But the connections didn't stop there. Jennifer recognized the dress the woman was wearing, a vintage piece with a distinctive floral pattern along the collar. Jennifer owned that exact dress. She had purchased it at an estate sale in 2015. The same estate sale, she realized with growing horror, where this photograph had been found. The dress had been part of the same collection. It hung in her closet, unworn, purchased on a whim because something about it had called to her. She had bought her own dress from the past, a dress she had apparently already worn, 72 years before she was born. Investigators asked Jennifer about the device in the photograph. She had no explanation. She had never time traveled, she insisted. She had no memory of the 1940s, no recollection of factory work, no knowledge of wartime Detroit. But the evidence was undeniable. Her face, her birthmark, her dress, her apparent smartphone, held casually in hands that wouldn't be born for decades. Some theorists believe that time travel may cause memory erasure. The mind, unable to process the paradox of existing in two times simultaneously, simply deletes the experience to protect itself. Perhaps Jennifer Holloway did travel to 1943. Perhaps she brought her phone with her. Perhaps she lived among those workers, was photographed, and then returned to her own time with no memory of where she had been. Jennifer sold the dress shortly after seeing the photograph. She says she sometimes dreams of assembly lines and air raid sirens, of the smell of machine oil and the sound of swing music on distant radios. But she insists these are only nightmares. The photograph remains unexplained. The face is hers. The birthmark is hers. The dress was hers. And the device in her hands looks exactly like technology that wouldn't exist for another 70 years. Imagine you're 4 years old. The world is simple. Your village, your family, the sea in the distance. But at night, when you close your eyes, something terrible waits. A building with a tall chimney, fire erupting into the sky, people running from something you cannot see, poison in the air that kills without sound. You wake up screaming and your parents hold you, telling you it was just a dream. But you know it wasn't. You've seen this place, you know its name, and it hasn't been destroyed yet. This is the story of Dmitry Petrov, a child who drew the Chernobyl disaster 7 years before it happened. In early 1979, Dmitry was living with his family in a small town roughly 200 kilometers from the Ukrainian city of Pripyat. He was a normal child by every measure, playful, curious, loved by his parents. But something changed that winter. The nightmares began. Every night, the same visions. A massive building with a red-striped chimney, an explosion that tore the roof apart, helicopters circling overhead, dropping sand from the sky, people in strange suits covering their faces, and everywhere, an invisible death spreading through the air. Dmitry couldn't articulate what he saw. He was too young for words like radiation or reactor. But he could draw. His mother saved the pictures, dozens of them, created over months. A child's crude hand depicting horrors no 4-year-old should comprehend. He drew the building again and again, always with the number 4 prominent on its side. He drew helicopters releasing streams of material onto flames below. He drew people fleeing in buses, their faces covered with cloth. He drew his grandmother's house, a place he had never visited, with weeds growing through the windows and doors nailed shut. His parents consulted doctors. Overactive imagination, they said, perhaps influenced by Cold War anxieties filtering down from adult conversations, perhaps processing fears he had absorbed from television. They prescribed calm environments and limited his exposure to news. But Dmitry kept drawing, and he kept naming a place he had never been. Pripyat. He said the word clearly, though his family had never mentioned it. He said it was where the bad building lived. Years passed. The drawings were filed away. Dmitry grew older. the nightmares faded, and the family moved on. His grandmother relocated to the Pripyat area in 1982 for work opportunities. Dmitry never visited her there. He refused, crying whenever the trip was suggested, insisting something bad would happen to her house. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The blast released 400 times more radiation than the Hiroshima bomb. Pripyat was evacuated within 36 hours. Over 300,000 people were permanently displaced. Dmitry's grandmother was among them. Her house was abandoned, left to decay inside the exclusion zone. Weeds eventually grew through the windows. The doors were sealed by authorities. When Dmitry's mother heard the news, she remembered the drawings. She retrieved them from storage, hands trembling as she spread them across her kitchen table. The building with the number 4. The helicopters dropping sand, exactly as responders had done to contain the fire. The evacuation buses, the hazmat suits. And her mother's house, abandoned and overgrown, exactly as it would appear in photographs taken years after the disaster. A child's hand had drawn the worst nuclear accident in history 7 years before it occurred. Dmitry Petrov is now in his 50s. He has no memory of the drawings. He doesn't remember the nightmares or the name he couldn't stop repeating. His mind, it seems, erased whatever connection had allowed him to see forward. But his mother kept everything. Every drawing dated 1979. Every image matching a catastrophe that wouldn't happen until 1986. Some researchers believe that young children exist in a more fluid relationship with time. Their consciousness hasn't fully crystallized into linear perception. They may be more susceptible to what some call temporal bleed-through, fragments of their own future memories reaching backward into childhood. Dmitry saw Chernobyl before Chernobyl existed. He drew the disaster in crayon and colored pencil. He knew the name of a city he had never visited, and no one understood until it was far too late. Imagine you're kneeling beside your grandfather's grave. The headstone is weathered, familiar, a place you visited every year since childhood. You're pulling weeds from the base, clearing away dried leaves, when you notice something strange. The soil has been disturbed, recently. You brush the dirt aside, and your fingers touch metal. A small container buried beneath the stone. Inside is a letter. The handwriting is yours. Every curve, every stroke, unmistakably your own. But the date at the top reads December 3rd, 2089. 73 years from now. This is what happened to Rachel Torres in the summer of 2016. And the letter she found would change her understanding of reality forever. Rachel was 32 years old, living in San Antonio, Texas. Her grandfather had passed away when she was 19, and visiting his grave had become a ritual, a moment of quiet reflection, a connection to a man who had shaped her childhood. On that particular afternoon, she noticed the disturbed earth immediately. At first, she assumed vandalism, perhaps an animal digging. But when she uncovered the small metal container, tarnished and strange, she knew something else was happening. The container was sealed with a mechanism she didn't recognize. It took her several minutes to open it. Inside, protected from moisture and decay, was a single folded letter. The paper felt wrong. Not old exactly, but unfamiliar. A texture she had never encountered, slightly synthetic, with a faint shimmer under direct light. She unfolded it carefully, and her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was hers, not similar, identical. The distinctive way she crossed her T's, the slight backward slant she had never been able to correct. Every letter was unmistakably written by her own hand, but the date read December 3rd, 2089. The letter was addressed to myself before everything changed. It contained information only Rachel could know, childhood memories she had never shared, her grandfather's final words spoken to her alone in his hospital room, a secret she had carried since adolescence, never written down, never spoken aloud. Whoever wrote this letter had access to the deepest corners of her mind, but the letter also contained warnings, specific dates, specific places, specific instructions. Avoid the intersection of Commerce and Flores on March 15, 2018. Invest in a company Rachel had never heard of. Stay away from a man whose name meant nothing to her at the time. The instructions were detailed, urgent, written with the weight of someone who desperately needed to be believed. Rachel was skeptical, terrified, but skeptical. She filed the letter away and tried to forget it. But March 15th, 2018 approached, and she couldn't ignore the warning. She avoided that intersection, taking a longer route to work. That afternoon, a gas line exploded at Commerce and Flores. 3 pedestrians were killed. Rachel would have been walking through that exact spot at that exact time. She retrieved the letter with shaking hands. Investigators analyzed the materials. The metal container was composed of an alloy consistent with theoretical projections of late 21st century metallurgy. The paper contained synthetic fibers not yet commercially available. The ink had chemical properties that didn't match any current manufacturing process. Everything about the letter suggested it came from a future that hadn't happened yet. Rachel has followed some of the letter's advice. The company she invested in has grown substantially. The man she was warned about later appeared in her life and proved to be exactly the danger the letter predicted. Other instructions she hasn't followed. Some, she says, she isn't ready to know yet. When asked if she believes she wrote the letter, Rachel pauses before answering. Quote underscore 9 underscore. Some theorists believe physical objects may be transferable across time under conditions we don't yet understand. Perhaps an elderly Rachel, decades from now, found a way to send a message backward. Perhaps she buried it in the one place her younger self would certainly find it. The letter still exists. The warnings continue to prove accurate, and somewhere in Rachel's future, she will apparently sit down and write to herself across 73 years of time. Imagine you're at a funeral. The church is filled with mourners dressed in black. Candles flicker against stained glass windows. At the front of the room, an open casket holds the body of a man you loved, your uncle, your friend, your mentor. He is gone. You watched him die. You saw his heart stop. And yet, as you sit in the wooden pew, wiping tears from your eyes, you notice a figure standing at the back of the church, an elderly man, watching the service with calm, knowing eyes. He looks familiar, too familiar, because the man standing at the back of the church is the same man lying in the casket, only 20 years older. This is what happened at the funeral of Eduardo Castillo in Buenos Aires, Argentina, September the 22nd, 1996. A day that over 100 witnesses have never been able to explain. Eduardo Castillo was 58 years old when he died of heart failure. A beloved businessman, a devoted husband, a man whose passing left a hole in the lives of everyone who knew him. His funeral was held at a small Catholic church in the Recoleta district. Family, friends, and colleagues filled every pew. His body, prepared by the local funeral home, lay in an open casket at the altar. The service proceeded normally until mourners began noticing the stranger. He stood at the back of the church, near the entrance. An old man, perhaps late 70s, wearing clothes that seemed slightly outdated. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if every step required careful thought. Several mourners later described a strange sense of recognition. They knew this man. They couldn't explain how, but they knew him. And then he began to speak. The old man approached Eduardo's niece, Maria, and spoke softly into her ear. He told her she would survive the accident and that she should trust the second doctor. Maria had no idea what he meant. She hadn't been in any accident. She didn't know any doctors, but she remembered his words precisely because of what he said next. He called her by a childhood nickname that only Eduardo had ever used. He moved to Eduardo's business partner, a man named Carlos, and told him the exact date his company would go public. A date that meant nothing in 1996. He approached Eduardo's widow, Sofia, and told her she would find love again. He told her to keep the house on the coast because it would matter someday. Several mourners realized simultaneously what they were seeing. The old man's face, his posture, the way he held his hands. He looked exactly like Eduardo Castillo, not as he appeared in the casket, but aged another 2 decades. When someone called out Eduardo's name, the old man simply nodded. Mourners began moving toward him, confusion and fear mixing in their whispers. The old man turned and walked toward the open casket at the front of the church. He stood beside it for a moment, looking down at his own body, and then he was gone. No door opened, no footsteps echoed. He simply vanished, standing directly beside the coffin where Eduardo's corpse still lay. In the years that followed, every prediction the old man made came true. In 2003, Maria was in a serious car accident. The first doctor misdiagnosed her injuries. The second saved her life. Carlos's company went public on the exact date mentioned. Sophia remarried in 2004 and still owns the coastal house. 8 witnesses provided sworn statements describing the encounter. Their accounts match in every detail. The old man knew things he couldn't possibly know. He delivered messages from a future that hadn't happened yet. And he attended his own funeral, standing feet away from his own corpse. Some researchers believe that death may not end consciousness, but liberate it from linear time. Perhaps Eduardo Castillo continued living somewhere, somewhen, and found a way to return, to say goodbye, to offer guidance from a perspective only the dead could possess. The body in the casket never moved. The man at the back of the church was never seen again. Eduardo Castillo apparently attended his own funeral from a future that, for him, had already happened. 10 cases, 10 survivors. Knowledge that couldn't exist. They described technologies before invention, disasters before destruction, futures before they arrived. Coincidence? Imagination? Or proof that time is not the straight line we believe it to be? Maybe these people slipped through cracks we don't understand. Maybe we all carry memories from times we haven't lived yet. The question isn't whether time travel is possible. The question is, would you recognize it if it happened to you? Subscribe for more. The answers might already be waiting.